Um, so we should get started. First of all, welcome. And this is not a formality, but a really distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Douglas Lowy, who's going to present an overview on HPV vaccination and screening. And obviously, this is a topic which is so very, very, very important because it really is one of the very limited capabilities we have in terms of a vaccine to go ahead and to prevent cancer. I'm welcoming Doug Lowy on behalf of a large group of colleagues in Northern New England, the Northern New England Clinical and Translational Research Network that represents initiatives to invest in health and healthcare in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, our colleagues in the University of Vermont Cancer Center, the Vermont Cancer Coalition. Who else? The American Cancer Society is very much involved in it. The Northern England Practice-Based Research Network, and we have several colleagues joining us from Massachusetts. First, the group that represents dentists who have been advocates not just for education with HPV vaccination, but providing HPV immunization, and our colleagues from the University of Massachusetts Cancer Center. I could probably spend 20 minutes this sharing with you Dr. Lowy's contributions because they've been enormous and far-reaching. He and John Schiller developed the HPV vaccine, and I'm not going to go ahead and to go on and on about how important that has been. The impact has been really, profound. But in addition to that, administratively, Doug Lowy has provided leadership for the National Cancer Institute, serving as a director, I think at least 4 times, and is currently the principal deputy director. And then in the laboratory, Doug Lowy has been a major contributor to trying to understand mechanisms and clinical implications for proto-oncogenes and tumor suppressors. So I promised I'd give Doug some time to speak, so I'm going to turn it over to him, and he's going to share with us an update on preventing HPV-associated malignancies by HPV vaccination and screening. Doug, thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, Gary. It's just really a pleasure to be here. And I'm looking forward not just to talking with you about what's going on with the vaccine, but also for there to be time for questions and comments afterwards. Next slide is my disclosure slide. And we have patents on the papillomavirus vaccine technology, and NIH has licensed that technology to Merck and GlaxoSmithKline, which are the two companies that make FDA-approved versions of the vaccine. I will mention two possible non-FDA approved interventions. One is fewer vaccine doses, and then in the area of cervical cancer screening, self-sampling. Uh, I have been involved with other technologies that have been licensed to a range of companies, but they're not relevant to this afternoon's talk. Next slide. So this slide gives you an outline of what I'm planning to discuss. First, to talk a little bit about the epidemiology of cervical cancer and, the theme that it predominantly affects poor women, not exclusively, but predominantly. And then to talk about the interventions to prevent cervical cancer. We'll spend most of the time on HPV vaccination, but cervical cancer screening is also critically important. And so I have a few slides about that. Before we get into the epidemiology, I have two slides that I want to show you because I think they really are relevant to this area. One is a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., who said, of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhuman. And this is an area where vaccination can really level the playing field as well as screening. Next slide is from a book that received the Pulitzer Prize more than 10 years ago now, called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. The HeLa cells are derived from her HPV-18 cervical carcinoma, from which she died in the early 1950s. And although there was the pap smear, adenocarcinoma of the cervix is very difficult to detect by cytology or pap smear. And the advances that have occurred are that sufficient that her cancer, if it were to occur today, should now be preventable by HPV vaccination or by HPV-based screening. So let's get to the epidemiology. Next, so cervical cancer pathogenesis is similar worldwide, but where in the world you live has a major impact on cervical cancer incidence and mortality, as you'll see in the next few slides. Next one. So this tells you what's happening in the United States from 2000 to 2020. And this is looking at the trends for mortality rates in the US. On the top in the red are Black women who started out with very high mortality rates, more than 5 per 100,000. And in the ensuing 20 years have gone down to about 3 per 100,000. In blue are shown Hispanic women. They started out at about 4 per 100,000 and now are at about 2.5 per 100,000. And white women actually started out just a little bit above 2 per 100,000 in 2000. And actually, there has been a plateau. So one of the problems that we have with cervical cancer is that although the mortality rates for Black and Hispanic women have come down, the first issue is they're still higher than they are for white women. But for white women, and probably also for Black women, if they were to reach the level of white women, there has been this plateau, and we want to try to get below 2 deaths per 100,000 in the long run. Next slide. So the next slide tells you that while we have a substantial disparity in the United States, Black women versus white women, about a 50% difference. If you look at incidence and mortality in Africa compared to the United States and Canada, there's actually about a five-fold difference in the incidence of cervical cancer in Africa compared to North America. And when you look at mortality rates, there's more than an eightfold difference. And this is depicted in the slide in the graph on the left. The blue represents incidence, the red represents mortality. If you drop down to the open blue rectangle in the near the bottom for North America, note that the blue is quite small, but the red is even smaller. What this tells you is most women in the United States and Canada who develop cervical cancer will actually not die from cervical cancer. The story is totally different when you go up to the upper to Africa and you look in the upper open red rectangle. The blue is now much, much bigger, incidence much higher. But the ratio, if you will, between the blue and the red is much lower than it was for North America. And most women in Africa who develop cervical cancer will die of cervical cancer. And we need to think about low and middle income countries because 90% of cervical cancer cases and deaths occur there. And at the current rate, they're projected to increase by about 2% each year. Next slide. And this slide basically tells you what is shown in the blue rectangle. The natural history is universal, the same in high resource settings and in low resource settings. That you start with infection shown by the green line, and then pre-cancer, uh, and then the red is invasive cancer. And there are several years of interval between each of these steps. And shown is that vaccination is for primary prevention. It prevents the infection. Screening is for secondary prevention. You already have the infection and you have dysplasia, but you interfere with the development of invasive cancer by treating the pre-cancer. Next slide. So there actually are three interventions against cervical cancer: vaccination, screening, but also the treatment of invasive cervical cancer. And in the United States, except for women whose cancers are detected really at a late stage, the treatment of invasive cancer is such that most women who develop invasive cancer actually won't die of the cancer. But it's far better for women not to develop cervical cancer in the first place by either by vaccination or screening. And that's what we're going to focus on. Next slide. So first, vaccination. Next slide tells you about what are the FDA approved vaccines. There actually are three, but the one on the bottom, Gardasil 9, is the only vaccine currently available in the United States. And if you look first at Cervarix, which is the GSK vaccine, FDA approved, but not sold anymore in the US. It just focuses on HPV 16 and 18, which, as you'll see in a subsequent slide, represents about 70% of cervical cancer and a higher percentage of the non-cervical cancers. Gardasil is very much like Cervarix, but in addition, it has virus-like particles for HPV 6 and 11, which together are responsible for about 90% of genital warts. And Gardasil 9, the second generation Merck vaccine, in addition to the four types in Gardasil, has the five next most oncogenic types shown in the light green: 31, 33, 45, 52, and 58. And if you'll direct your attention briefly to the upper right, it shows what the vaccine looks like. These are HPV virus-like particles. And the technology that we developed was that basically when you express this gene in cells, it self-assembles to make these virus-like particles. And that's what's responsible for making the vaccine highly immunogenic, highly protective, and the protection is durable. Next slide. So this slide is taken from data from the Centers for Disease Control. And what it shows you is in the darker blue, those cancers caused by HPV 16 and 18 that are present in the first generation vaccines. In the lighter blue, the HPV types that 31, 33, 45, 52, and 58 that are in Gardasil 9. And in the white, the HPV types that cause these cancers, but are not in Gardasil 9. So what I want you to appreciate first is that the top are the female cancers and the bottom are the male cancers. And I want you to see that the number of oropharynx cancers that occur in males due to HPV in the United States are actually more than the number of cervical cancers that occur in women. Uh, and oropharynx cancer also occurs in women, and that's shown on the bottom with the female number, but it's predominated by males with oropharynx cancer. But there are several other cancers which are less common than those other than cervix and oropharynx. Uh, Vagina, vulva, anus, and anal cancer. Women actually account for a majority of the anal cancer, men also get anal cancer, and penile cancer is the least common and just present in men. About 40% of HPV-associated cancer in the United States occurs in male, and about 60% occurs in females. In low and middle income countries, more than 90% of HPV-associated cancer occurs in females because of the predominance of cervical cancer. Uh, the red line is just to show you that although there are a similar number of cases, if you will, between cervical cancer and oropharynx cancer, there are many more cases of cervical cancer due to the 5 additional types in Gardasil 9 compared with oropharynx. Most of the oropharynx cancer, a higher proportion, are due to HPV 16 and 18, and the vast majority of those are HPV 16. Next slide. So this, at a time when the HPV vaccine uptake was not going the way one had wanted, the CDC made this public service announcement for mathematically challenged people. One vaccine plus 2 doses equals protection against 6 types of cancer. Next slide. And this tells you very important, what about safety? Because most people who are given the vaccine aren't going to benefit from it, in that they weren't destined to get either high-grade dysplasia or invasive cancer. So the safety data, both for 4-VHPV is Gardasil and 9-VHPV is Gardasil 9, the safety data have been very good for both of them. And these are 2 review articles from the Centers for Disease Control. Next slide. And what about the protection? So here are 4 important clinical results. Let's start on the upper left. The vaccine has very high efficacy, more than 95%, but it also has a long duration of protection, more than 10 years. And then if you look on the upper right, the vaccine confers sterilizing immunity. What this means is it prevents infection in most vaccinees. And probably as a consequence, if you look on the bottom left, the vaccine induces herd immunity or herd protection, even with suboptimal vaccine uptake. And I'll show you some data from Australia about herd protection because they are so dramatic. The bottom right tells you, as excellent as the vaccine is at preventing the development of new infection, it does not alter the natural history of established infection. It does not treat established infection. And that's why it's so important to vaccinate people before they become sexually active. Next slide. So this slide really gives you data from Denmark. What about the reduction in cervical cancer? And these are real world data in Denmark published a few years ago. And they were using Gardasil. And what I've circled here in green on the left is that there's almost a 90% decrease in women who were vaccinated when they were 16 or younger compared to the women of that age who were not vaccinated. Uh, and so the vaccine has strong protection against the development of cervical cancer. If you move over to the graph all the way on the right, you can see that there's basically a superposition between the black, which are the unvaccinated women, and the red, which are the vaccinated women. These are women who were vaccinated between 20 and 30. It's not that the vaccine isn't helpful in women who are that age. It's that by the time that they are of that age, a high percentage of them are already HPV infected, and the vaccine doesn't uh, treat their prevalent or established infection. And so they develop cervical cancer, presumably due to the HPVs that they had before they got vaccinated. Women between 17 and 19, there's some protection, but nowhere near as much as if they were vaccinated when they were younger. And similar data have been seen with the bivalent vaccine, the GSK vaccine. Next slide. And here in the United States, an uncommon but important problem is recurrent respiratory papillomatosis. Juvenile onset occurs in children before they are 5, and women who are pregnant with their first pregnancy are particularly susceptible, if they have HPV infection, to develop juvenile onset recurring respiratory papillomatosis.
What's
And
up?
these data
What's up?
tell you that before the introduction of the vaccine, that there was a certain number of cases, and uh, after introduction of the vaccine, by 2012 and 13, there's been a dramatic reduction in the incidence of this condition, which for the children who develop it can really be devastating, require multiple surgeries, et cetera. And so this is a reduction because the cases are due to HPV-6 or 11, and Gardasil protects you against HPV-6 and 11 infection. Next slide. Uh, and this is the dramatic result about herd immunity. This is for looking at the incidence of genital warts in heterosexual Australian men following female HPV vaccination in 2007, shown by the vertical horizontal line. And if you look at the incidence of the heterosexual men in the darker green blue between 2007 and 2010, dramatic difference if they were under 21. These men were not vaccinated, but a high percentage of the women that they had sex with were vaccinated. And so the incidence of genital warts in the men went down dramatically, p-value very significant. If you look now higher up in the red dotted line, these are older men from 21 to 30. Again, a very sharp reduction, again, with very big p-value, and these men were not vaccinated. If you look in the interrupted green line, the p-value is not statistically significant. These are the men who are over 30, who presumably their sexual partners were of their age, and so they had not been vaccinated. So this is a dramatic example of herd immunity or herd protection. And in the United States, we now have uptake that was very similar to what happened in 2007 and 2008 in Australia. Next slide. So why should we be giving people the vaccine? So in less developed countries, the main goal of the vaccine is to protect against cervical cancer because, as I mentioned, more than 90% of HPV-associated cancer in low and middle income countries occurs in women. So female vaccination is most cost effective. In more developed countries, such as the United States, we want to vaccinate both men and women, so-called gender neutral vaccination, because we want to protect both males and females against a range of HPV-associated cancer. And as I mentioned, about 40% of these occur in men. Female vaccination with high uptake is most cost effective, but adding male vaccination can confer even greater protection for vaccinees than can herd immunity alone. Male vaccination is the fastest way to reduce HPV prevalence in men who have sex with men. So there are a lot of benefits for vaccinating men in addition to women if you have sufficient resources to be able to provide them. Next slide. So these next two slides talk about HPV vaccine uptake in the United States. Uh, and this one looks at national vaccine coverage among adolescents 13 to 17. And uh, on the top is uh, the boys and girls who have had at least one dose of the vaccine. And on the bottom are those who were up to date with vaccination. That is 2 doses through age 14 and 3 doses between 15 and 17. And if we just focus on the top, 1 dose or more, notice, first of all, the number is pretty high. It's over 70%, even in 2019. The second is during the pandemic, 2020, 21, and 22, the rate of vaccination did not go down. It actually increased a bit. Vaccine hesitancy has been an issue for HPV vaccination, but vaccine hesitancy associated with SARS-CoV-2 vaccination does not seem to have bled over to vaccination with HPV vaccination, perhaps because the main target groups or the main for the different vaccines are so vastly different, where you're talking about adolescents being the main target group for HPV vaccination, whereas much older people for SARS-CoV-2 vaccination. Uh, so that was what I was trying to tell you on this slide. And then the next slide tells you what's been going on in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Uh, and this is from data for 2023. The United States, as you saw in 2023, 77% one or more doses. Maine is a little bit below that, 73%. New Hampshire and Vermont are substantially higher. But if you look on the right, you can appreciate that the incidence of cervical cancer in the United States is actually higher than in any of the 3 states of Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. And this is also true of mortality rates. So the mortality rates in the 3 states are actually substantially lower than in US wide, but that doesn't mean there isn't room for further improvement. And then on the bottom, I've shown you what I think are Mississippi, the lowest uptake in the U.S., just 60% of 1 dose or more, and Rhode Island, the highest uptake, 93%. But what is really the shame, and your 3 states have nothing to do with it, is Mississippi has a real problem with cervical cancer. And from a public health point of view, you really wish that their vaccine uptake was what was in Rhode Island. And Rhode Island, obviously, people, women get cervical cancer, but they are very similar in terms of their profile to Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. So there is this imbalance which we really need to try to correct between incidence of mortality from HPV-associated cancer in some states and vaccine uptake. Next slide. So in some ways, this is my most important slide because it tells you over time that provider recommendation for HPV vaccination is a major factor or a major determinant in whether adolescent boys and girls are going to be vaccinated. There's about a 20% difference. And the difference is so consistent between 2015 and 2020. So telling people that it's time for their vaccine actually makes a big difference. Next slide. And I have one slide where I'm just asking the question, not advocating for it necessarily, but should there be a school entry requirement for HPV vaccination? And it's required in two states, Rhode Island and Virginia, as well as in the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. Their uptake for one or more doses is 85 to 91%, which is substantially higher than the US-wide rate of 77%. What about school entry requirements for other adolescent vaccines? So Tdap, tetanus pertussis, uh, uh, I'm, I'm sorry, uh, tetanus pertussis and diphtheria, they have they are now recommended in all three of your states for school entry. It's a requirement. For meningococcal vaccination, it's required in Maine and Vermont, but not in New Hampshire. And so my question for you all is, do you want to consider aligning HPV vaccination with requirements for Tdap and meningococcal vaccination? And this is something for you all to discuss and debate and perhaps think about going forward with that. Next slide. So I'm now going to change to uh, ongoing research. Might a single HPV vaccine dose confer strong protection? This is not FDA approved. So first, let's go to the next slide. Why might this be important? Well, currently, only about 10% of adolescent girls in low and middle income countries are vaccinated against HPV. And if we could get down to below one dose, to below two doses, that might be transformative. And through research that we and others have done, the WHO Strategic Advisory Group of experts on immunization recommended either an off-label recommendation of one dose or two doses for 9 to 20-year-old women 2 years ago. This was adopted by the WHO. And as you'll see in the next slide, it actually has led to some implementation of one dose in countries outside the United States. We don't follow the WHO recommendations, so we are still where we have been. So what we've been trying to do at NCI is compile more evidence that one dose of the vaccine can induce long-term protection because we think single dose, less expensive than two doses, logistically easier than two doses, but as I said, not yet fully standard of care. Next slide. So this shows you some of our data where it shows you the antibody persistence for one dose, two doses, or three doses in our initial trial in Costa Rica. And what happens is when you get to a plateau phase, I mean, first of all, one dose, once you get a decrease over the first year or to 18 months, the antibody levels remain constant. They are durable. And they're only about 4 times lower than three doses. And very important, shown in the first bullet point, 100% of the one dose recipients remain seropositive with an efficacy as high as that from two doses or three doses. And we have similar data with 15 years, and they have been submitted for publication. Uh, the similar results have been seen. These are results with the bivalent vaccine, the GlaxoSmithKline vaccine, but the International Agency for Research on Cancer trial in India has shown similar data with Gardasil. So we think that they should be relevant. Next slide. So we're doing a large one dose vaccine trial. We're comparing the efficacy of one dose versus two doses for two FDA approved vaccines, Gardasil 9 and Cervarix. Cervarix is the GSK vaccine. And Amy Kramer from NCI is the principal investigator from NCI, and Rolando Herrero is the principal investigator from Costa Rica. And the trial is partially supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Next slide. So what what the next slide tells you is what the impact has been uh, for the World Health Organization off-label recommendation. By mid 2024, actually 48 countries have been introducing single dose vaccination. Most of them are in low and middle income countries, but some are in high income countries, such as the United Kingdom and Australia. Importantly, other countries reviewed the recommendation and said the data were not yet sufficient to go to one dose. It remains at 2 and 3 doses, as I mentioned, in the US, likely to go to single dose recommendation if the evidence from our trial show protection from one dose is not inferior to 2 doses. Next slide. So the last topic that I want to talk about briefly is cervical cancer screening. And this slide shows you why. Modeling indicates that if you do screening that you increase to 90%, that you can you can reduce the incidence of cervical cancer much faster than if you scale up vaccination to 90% and leave screening at the status quo. And so you could go down to 4 cases per 100,000 10 years earlier if you increased cervical cancer screening compared to vaccination increase. I'm not advocating that we shouldn't do more HPV vaccination. I'm simply saying it takes much longer for the impact of the vaccine to be seen. Next slide. We should be concerned about this because the percentage of women who were overdue for cervical cancer screening between 2005 and 2019, before the pandemic, actually increased from 14% to 23%. And the and those who were overdue for screening, Black and white women who had insurance pretty similar, but the uninsured and public insurance were lower. And so it becomes really important to try to improve the uptake of cervical cancer screening and maybe to change the paradigm. So this next slide tells you about that. Uh, and the HPV testing is replacing cytology. It has high positive and negative predictive value. And what we are currently doing is trying to get FDA approval of self-sampling of genital swabs, which can detect HPV DNA. It's just become partially FDA approved, but the swab actually can't yet be done at home. And I just want to point out cervical cancer screening mainly identifies precancer, highly curable. Next slide. And this is a current trial that we're doing, so-called cervical cancer last mile initiative. And the goal is to overcome the barrier of full FDA approval for self-sampling approaches for HPV testing based cervical cancer screening. Uh, and we're hopeful that this trial will provide evidence that will enable the FDA to really give full approval so that cervical cancer screening could begin at home, because we think that could really have a big impact on further reducing the cervical cancer incidence and mortality by screening. Now, I'd like to summarize. Next slide. So I have two slides of take-home messages. First, these four. The vaccine induces long-term protection against the HPV types in the vaccine, but it does not treat established infection. Second, cervical cancer screening remains very important. It can reduce mortality faster than vaccination and prevent cancer after women have been infected. Third, vaccine uptake in the US has increased even during the COVID pandemic. However, there has been limited uptake in low and middle income countries, which have the largest cancer burden, which is mainly cervical cancer. And last, single dose vaccination, if it were approved, could increase worldwide vaccine uptake. And then the second take home message, this is just a summary, the most effective prevention of HPV-associated cancer will result from HPV vaccination for young people and cervical cancer screening for adults. My last slide is really to thank you, and I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments, which Seth is going to be moderating.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Lowery. So I'd welcome attendees to provide any questions that they have in the question and answer, or to raise their hand and ask their questions directly. And I will be helping to facilitate this session of question and answers, which I can begin. Doug, would you want to share your
Sure. So let me just try. Meredith Plumpton, is telling us, beyond what I have said, very important. And Kim Daly is also telling us something that beyond what I said, again, very important. Meredith Plumpton is saying making HPV required for school would have to go through the legislature. It's not a decision that we can make. I'm sorry if I was not clear. Yes, of course, but the other school age requirements have already gone through the legislature. And my guess is they go through the legislature in part because public health and other people recommend it to the legislature that this is something that would be advisable. I am not taking a position on it personally. I'm simply saying you have high uptake, you have school age requirements for other adolescent vaccines. Might you want to think about their alignment? And Dr. Plumpton, please, did you want to say more?
No, thank you. I just wanted to point out that that's definitely not a decision that we can make on our own. And the other thing that I wanted to say is, yes, we do require meningococcal, the ACWY for boarding schools or residential schools. We don't require it for our normal middle or high school entry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I apologize. I simply went to the CDC website, and unfortunately, I am a lumper and not a splitter. Thank you for these clarifications. Ben Littenberg is asking, why was Cervarix included in the one-dose trial? Great question. So the reason is that the adjuvant that Cervarix uses is a much stronger adjuvant than what Merck uses. And we were concerned that if you went down to one dose, that it might work for the GSK vaccine for Cervarix, but might not work as well for the Merck vaccine. And so we did it just to see. I mean, we're certainly hopeful that both vaccines that the efficacy for one dose will not be inferior. Dr. Littenberg, did you want to say more about that?
I was wondering about the cost of the Cervarix versus the Merck. Is it or the two vaccines? Is there an advantage, a big cost advantage to the Cervarix that might help worldwide usage?
So at the moment, the worldwide cost is going to vary because Merck basically engages in negotiations with different groups, and GSK does as well. So I don't know whether one would be more expensive or less expensive than the other. The Gardasil 9 has the advantage of targeting more HPV types than Cervarix. Cervarix has more what's called cross protection, but in other words, it gives protection against some of those additional types that are in Gardasil 9, but not all of them. And Cervarix doesn't give you the strong protection against genital warts the way that Gardasil 9 does. But there is now the advent of basically biosimilar vaccines made in China and also in India, and they are in the process of trying to get approval from the WHO for one dose, but that hasn't happened yet. Dr. Lindberg, any more questions?
No, top-notch talk, and thank you for your responses. Very good.
Thanks. Luke Cunliffe, I thought we've continued to see coverage has not improved. Yes. Yeah. Dr. Cunliffe, that's what the headlines show. This is what the data show. I have a different take from what some people say. The 2008 birth cohort had a little bit of a decrease, but overall, vaccine uptake has not been dramatically negatively impacted by the pandemic. And my data are from the MMWR report from August of this year.
Looks like Gary Stein has his hand raised.
Yes. First of all, thank you very much, for an incredibly informative presentation and for outlining some strategies that we really need to go ahead and seriously consider in terms of moving forward. The statistics are, very satisfying when you look at Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine as well, in terms of where we are with HPV inoculation compared to the national averages. However, when you compare the limited populated counties like Chittenden County in Vermont, and then look at some of the more rural counties like Essex, you find that there are some, striking deficiencies once you get into the lesser populated areas. So I guess what I'm saying is there's a lot yet to be done that we really need to take on as a responsibility.
Yeah, Gary, thank you. What you're pointing out is also true nationwide. Places of lower population density tend to be vaccinated to a lower degree than places with higher population density.
Yeah.
Right. If there are any other questions, feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat at this time. I want to remind everybody that this seminar it was recorded and will be available on the NNECTR website next week, and that also the slides can be made available as well. If you're interested in receiving those slides, please put your name and email in the chat as well. Matt Dugan.
Hey, yeah, since all the more sophisticated questions are out of the way, Dr. Lowy, I was curious about the one dose, since we have time to ask this one, versus 2 or 3 doses. Prior to this talk, I assumed that the one dose coming down the pipeline had to do with a different formulation. And I got the impression from your talk that it's really about longitudinally looking at one dose of original or slightly updated formulations.
No, that's a great question. It might be even better, if you will, if there were a special formulation. But we've tried to do this with off-the-shelf vaccine. I mean, basically, we simply bought Gardasil 9 from Merck, and we bought Cervarix from GSK, and we're using, and we're using the vaccine that we bought for one dose or two doses. Yeah, I mean, because we just thought it's simpler right now. If that works, then you could just modify it by not giving the booster doses. And just so you know, we're also doing efficacy trials in older groups of women. The trial I'm talking about is women who are 12 to 16. And we're doing efficacy trial in women 18 to 30 because we feel that if we can demonstrate one dose in those groups, then we could get really a much wider recommendation for one dose beyond just the adolescent population.
Thank you. Follow-up. Why were 2 or 3 doses originally recommended then? This is a question
Yeah.
from a person who doesn't know anything
Sure,
about
sure.
vaccines.
No, great question. The cynical view might be so that the pharmaceutical companies could charge as much as possible, but that's probably not correct. Okay. What happened is that they used HPV vaccination as the model. And HPV vaccination was a 3-dose vaccination. In addition, companies had been burned with with herpes vaccines that worked in animals but didn't work in people. Okay, and so that's trying to protect against another genital infection. And so they thought they should start with a large number of doses. And it was shown in preliminary studies that giving 3 doses seemed to be optimal in terms of short-term antibody results. Okay. And so what has happened is that basically several years after the vaccine was approved, GSK went for approval for 2 doses. That was in Europe, okay? And Merck actually came along because they didn't want to be behind GSK. And they actually got approval with studies done in Canada with 2 doses that were not performed by Merck. Okay. And so fast forward, when we saw our data now almost 10 years ago, that it looked like women who got 1 dose were doing as well as women who got 2 and 3 doses. And we saw the antibody levels, we, basically hypothesized 1 dose could be enough. But, it's one thing to say it, it's something else to have strong evidence to support that speculative hypothesis.
Thank you. And thanks for a very informative talk too.
Well, if there are no questions, thank you to you, for all of you, for what you do. I mean, my parents were both general practitioners. There is no higher calling than trying to help people. Thank you.
Dr. Lowy, thank you very, very much. And I'm speaking on behalf of my colleagues in Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and in Massachusetts. And what you have done has truly made a difference, not just in terms of developing the vaccine, but also in terms of advocating for its utilization. You are appreciated. Thanks again.